Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus Weekend Edition, powered by the Center Square. I'm Greg Bishop, Illinois editor at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week for Illinois in Focus, the Center Square reporter Jim Talamonte and I will discuss the ongoing efforts of the Trump administration to address public safety in Chicago, with the state suing President Donald Trump and others to block the use of the National Guard. We've also got stories impacting elections and politics and stories about the upcoming fall veto session. All of that and more when we return for more Illinois in Focus Weekend Edition, powered by the Center Square.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. The week started with allegations. Chicago police issued stand-down orders when federal law enforcement requested help, and Governor J.B. Pritzker announcing a lawsuit against the Trump administration for using the National Guard in Illinois. By Wednesday night, the Guard arrived from Texas with official word the Illinois National Guard will be deployed as well. The orders give the U.S. Department of Homeland Security the lead and will last 60 days. As we record this Thursday afternoon, we await the outcome of a motion for a temporary restraining order against the Trump administration for use of the Guard. From the federal court building in Chicago, covering this story is the Center Square's Jim Talamonte. Jim, listeners should get to thecentersquare.com for the latest on this, but tell us what you heard in court today.
Yeah, interesting discussion back and forth. Didn't really expect this hearing to go as long as it did, but there were some questions about a declaration submitted by the government referring to a witness in terms of the need, or at least the federal government's claim that there is a need for National Guard troops to protect this courthouse, the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago, on Friday due to a couple of high-profile cases related to the ongoing immigration enforcement efforts in Chicago. And so there was some question about that, and a modified declaration needed to be filed. So that then took some time to get that sorted out. And so really two parts to this in terms of the federal government's filing for why this National Guard deployment is needed. And the deployment is needed, according to the U.S. government, for the Trump administration and the U.S. Army, really named in the state's lawsuit. But according to the Trump administration, the protection is needed at the Broadview ICE facility due to the, as the government said, agitators and the violent protests and the riots that have gone on there. And then also the second part of that at the Dirksen Federal Building for specifically these Friday court cases. But the judge expressed some concern, repeatedly expressed concern about the lack of specifics and how the need for the troops could be extended to other parts of the city, other parts not just of Cook County, but throughout the state of Illinois, and that this was narrow. This wasn't narrow enough at all. In fact, if anything, it was wide open, and that theoretically troops could be sent anywhere, anytime. And so from the standpoint of the U.S. government, the deputy U.S. Attorney General who was handling the oral arguments, Eric Hamilton, said, well, there's deference to the president. The president has great open-ended powers here, essentially, to deploy the troops as needed. And it is specific to these certain circumstances, but that's not necessarily in the written argument here from the government. So the judge had a lot of concern about that. And then on the other hand, the state of Illinois, the Christopher Wells from the Illinois Attorney General's office, he explained why he felt constitutionally the deployment should not be allowed. And then toward the end of his arguments, he got into some of the language we've heard from Governor J.B. Pritzker, that this is a situation of where there is a line between state and local law enforcement and the military. And he said the president was using his power and the court was needed to check the power of the president. This was, he said, used the word, a terrifying pattern of conduct, Wells from the Illinois Attorney General's office. So the arguments were made from both sides. Judge had some pointed questions for both sides, but certainly more pointed questions for Hamilton and the U.S. government than for the state of Illinois and the Attorney General's office.
So we're still waiting for any kind of outcome on these preliminary issues and how that's going to impact what is now potentially hundreds of National Guard troops from Texas and Illinois being deployed into Chicago. And you have the back and forth between Governor J.B. Pritzker and President Donald Trump all week, Jim. It has been daily, where if the governor doesn't have an event, the president does, and he's talking about the governor. This has been boiling over now for weeks, and here we are with headlines like Pritzker saying federal thuggery prompted the lawsuit. You've got the ongoing spat online of Trump saying that Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson should be jailed. And even Pritzker telling MSNBC that Trump should come and get him. This is something that I think is going to be sticking around for a bit, and people need to get to thecentersquare.com to get the latest on this story. But, Jim, one thing that also is interesting this week is the president mentioned several times, quote, beautiful black women wearing MAGA hats.
That's right. Yeah, and he was almost certainly referring to Chicago Flips Red. That group held a press conference inside City Hall, and they were rather quick to point out that they were inside City Hall, a place they felt was filled with corruption, and that the president of the United States, they were calling him to come and save Chicago from this corruption. And so one of the ladies that I don't know if she was specifically part of Chicago Flips Red, but she's appeared with them and she's spoken before city council hearings and committee hearings. Jessica Jackson said this was a love note from the president. The president sent us love notes that because he referred to the beautiful black women in Chicago wearing MAGA hats. And the president made a couple of those references this week. So it's very interesting, though. The governor of Illinois has been really, since Trump was inaugurated in January, said, weekly, if not daily, either statements or press conference or events, focusing on criticism of the president. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen the president especially really ramping up his rhetoric about Chicago. And so it was taken very well by the ladies of Chicago Flips Red and their supporters that the president appeared to be mentioning them or referring to them. And they took that as a real positive and said their numbers are growing. And they said, it's not just us. There are thousands like us. And you're going to see in the next election. So that remains to be seen, but it's been quite a back and forth. And, supporters on both sides have kind of lined up behind whether it be the governor or whether it be the president. And there's been, there's just no sign, though, that the rhetoric is going to be tamped down or the volume is going to be lowered anytime soon. At least it doesn't seem that way.
And practically on the ground, you have some different outcomes locally that we reported on at the Center Square. And this kind of feeds into what's happening on the ground. As you've got now National Guard troops, you had Broadview earlier this week issue executive orders limiting protesters from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening. Then you had Chicago do an executive order giving ice-free zones. And this is something that's adding to the ongoing debate back and forth here. But also, Jim, while you were in court hearing the arguments back and forth about the use of the National Guard, the Trump administration held a cabinet meeting where Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced that she's looking to buy more property in Chicago for law enforcement efforts. All of this really just a continuously developing story, and we're on top of it at thecentersquare.com. All right, Jim, let's continue talking about public safety. Obviously, as you mentioned, you've got the Chicago Flips Red group that's out there saying that they're getting love notes from President Donald Trump. But you've also got just the ongoing back and forth in politics. With the upcoming elections, the 2026 midterms, and Governor J.B. Pritzker made a visit to Minneapolis to sit with former vice presidential candidate Tim Walz. You covered that. Tell us what kinds of things they were talking about.
Yeah, it was interesting. The Walz was definitely the quieter, more modified voice in the room for this panel. Of course, both of them were very critical of the Trump administration, as you'd expect. But in particular, Governor Pritzker, beyond his criticism of the Trump administration, he took aim at the Republican leaders of the Illinois legislature, and he didn't mention Illinois House Leader Tony McCombie by name, House Republican Leader Tony McCombie by name, or Illinois Senate Republican leader John Curran, but he almost certainly was referring to those two, because he talked about how the Republican leaders in the legislature were after a social media influencer. According to the governor, there were social media influencers embedded with federal immigration enforcement officials, and they were making the rounds and taking video. And one of them, the governor said, went in front of his house and was then essentially blaming him for the murder of Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, which had just happened a short time before. And he said he called the state's GOP leaders and expressed the hope that they would stand up for him, and that if they could post something publicly or put out a statement. Well, McCombie fired back with a statement of her own, and she had said she had already spoken out repeatedly about denouncing violence. And Curran put out around that time a joint statement with the leading Senate Democrat in the state of Illinois, Don Harmon, the Senate president, denouncing violence. And McCombie went so far as to say that the president deliberately lied to score a political hit, lied about her record, and really fired back at the governor for essentially going to Minnesota and then calling out the two Illinois Republican leaders in the state legislature and saying they didn't stand up for him. And there was some question, too, as to whether the governor he said he called them, but it sounds like there's some dispute, too, as to whether there was a phone call or simply a text or some other form of communication. But interesting, the legislature is not even in session, and the governor's out of state, but he diverted a little bit for what he was talking about, and it just kind of came out of the blue then that he appeared to really take quite a verbal shot at the two Republican leaders in the Illinois legislature, who, of course, are in the super minority in the Illinois General Assembly.
Well, Jim, earlier this week, there was a freshman Republican state senator holding a town hall style event on his social media. And he said he's been in the legislature now for almost a year, and he hasn't met Governor J.B. Pritzker.
Yeah, Lee Arellano Jr., he's an Army veteran. He's the former mayor of Dixon, Illinois, and he's the state senator from Dixon. And he said the governor's not interested in unity. He said his first real introduction to the governor came at the budget address, the State of the State in February, but he didn't actually get to meet the governor. He said, I've never met the guy. I've tried, but he's not meeting with Republicans. Arellano said, I've talked to his staff. They've been nice. I'm not taking shots at them, but the governor has never agreed to meet with me, and he's just not speaking with Republicans. And Arellano then went on to say that Pritzker's stoking division with the language he's using, that it's much different language than he used during his first term. And indeed, as I said, since the inauguration of Donald Trump in January, we've heard multiple Nazi references. We've heard thuggery. We've heard jackboots. We've had tyrant or tyranny. Just a lot of very strong language from the governor about the president and the Trump administration and ICE. He's referred to ICE, in terms of the jackboots and just using a lot of strong language. So Arellano said, well, this isn't for someone who's says he's looking for unity. It's just not happening. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's any kind of collaborative discussion during the fall veto session here coming up in the next few days, or if just these battle lines are going to continue and we're going to have these dug in trenches, World War I style, it seems, where at least from a verbal standpoint, it's just back and forth firing. And it just doesn't seem that even as we may be getting some hope for peace in the Middle East, it's not appearing to be that way in terms of the political divisions in Illinois.
Yeah, and we've got, Republicans saying that Democrats are lying about public safety issues and even the federal government shutdown, and Democrats pointing to Republicans saying it's them that are responsible for the federal government shutdown. Obviously, all of this is going to work into political messaging as we get to the 2026 midterm election. But one thing's interesting, Jim, impacting elections could be a case that the U.S. Supreme Court heard this week. It was the case that Republican Illinois Congressman Mike Bost brought back in 2022 about the state counting federal election ballots up to 2 weeks after the election day. The arguments they make are that an election day is one day, not 14, and they need to have certainty on an outcome on election day evening. But obviously, as we've seen in the courts, Jim, everything from the gun ban to what you're dealing with right now there Thursday as we record this, the federal court building up in Chicago with the case against the Trump administration over the National Guard. Preliminary issues can always slow these things down. So what the U.S. Supreme Court heard was not about the ballot counting issue. It was more about whether Mike Bost had standing as a candidate to bring that lawsuit.
Yeah, really remarkable. And I guess Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency never really got around to the judiciary. Does Bost, he was a candidate, but there was an argument from the state that a blanket candidate standing rule would cause chaos for election officials while saddling federal courts with resolving abstract policy disputes. And so, and that there could then be increased lawsuits. So just remarkable that Bost was a candidate, wouldn't be granted candidate standing. But these are the kind of discussions, and you really get into some language and linguistic issues and that kind of thing. And of course it does. It takes more time in the judicial process, more money, more taxpayer expense, more federal employee time. So it's going to be interesting to continue to watch that as the justices took that case under advisement. But again, the results that maybe some were hoping would come fairly soon may still be quite a ways off in the distance.
You know, Jim, we're going to be obviously pretty busy for the rest of this week, and I encourage people to go check out thecentersquare.com for the latest headlines. You can get the newsletter in your inbox free each and every day. Just go to thecentersquare.com, click newsletter, and get that ready so that you can get the latest when we get it here with the Center Square. But Jim, next week's going to be busy. We've got the beginning of fall veto session. It's going to be 6 days. 3 next week. We'll have a week off from the legislature, and then the following week they'll be in for another 3 days. Do you think 6 days altogether for the rest of October is enough to tackle some major issues, dealing with energy policy, dealing with the mass transit fiscal cliff, dealing with vetoes? Is 6 days going to be enough?
Yeah, I don't know. I really think a lot of people think, especially people who are certainly in favor of some kind of legislation moving, would like to see more time than that. Of course, so the other side of that argument is, well, there's the spring session is so long and sometimes so little gets done that lawmakers need to learn to be more efficient. But certainly you mentioned, energy may even surpass transit as the top issue really facing Illinois. We saw electric bills skyrocket around the state and the summer, but then transit's still there. Certainly a lot of people, most I think, would like to see something done, at least with governance, even though the funding of the fiscal cliff doesn't seem to be quite as much of a crisis, so to speak, quote unquote, as people have said before. And then you have the veto of the Michael Frericks, the treasurer's bill for nonprofit investments that Governor Pritzker vetoed against the wishes of the treasurer. So that was going to be very interesting to see if Frericks has that veto-proof majority to carry that forward.
And obviously, we're going to be watching that closely. We'll be updating you daily with what's going on at the legislature. But we talked about in the past, Jim, that the mass transit fiscal cliff could possibly be one of the big issues. As you mentioned, energy may actually dominate during the fall veto session. But what's also interesting about the mass transit cliff is they seem to have revised the number downward.
Yeah, big time, by more than half. And we were up, State Senator Don DeWitt said at one point he was using the number 770 million, up from 760 million. Now we're down around 300 million. And this is due to some revenues that have come in on one hand, and then also Regional Transit Authority, RTA, transfers to the various agencies, especially the CTA, which the CTA is the agency in the most direst of the straits of the transit agencies. And so, and this, of course, has been part of the argument. Everyone outside of Chicago saying, well, this is a bailout for Chicago and the poor governing that has gone on with the CTA. There's now new leadership in place at the CTA, but still, and of course, federal funding has come into the mix here as well, as the U.S. government, the Trump administration, putting a pause on some of these transit funding projects in the city of Chicago. So a lot to digest, and that coming into the picture may give the transit advocates and those who want to impose the taxes and the fees to push transit forward, that the federal pauses may give the those who support the additional taxes for transit a little more ammunition, so to speak, going into the veto session.
Well, and that pause is $2.1 billion for two different Chicago Transit Authority projects that rely on that federal money, and those federal tax dollars are being held, as the federal government says, while they review contracts that deal with race and gender-based preferences, and saying that is discriminatory and wasteful and illegal. So they're going to be investigating that. So obviously the transit issue is going to be something. And on that note of the issue of DEI type contracting, if you get to thecentersquare.com, you'll be able to search for the fiscal fallout stories, where our investigative team has been digging into the cost to you, the taxpayer, of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and how the question is, are they really given many results? So you can find that story as well, again, at thecentersquare.com. But sticking with the issue of the fiscal cliff, Jim, we saw the Senate pass a tax increase and didn't get through the House during spring session. But what do you think now with the prospects of them diminishing the fiscal cliff more than half? Are we still possibly going to see a tax increase? How are they going to fund what, even labor is saying is going to be a really difficult time for mass transit workers?
Yeah, well, I think that's there still definitely are advocates for that retail delivery tax. It didn't get through. Perhaps there's been some talk that tax could be modified, reduced a little bit. Republicans have suggested using interest off the road fund as a possible way to help fund transit. The real estate transit tax, I haven't heard as much about that. That was an unpopular measure, perhaps a big part of the reason that bill didn't get through before the end of session in the spring. And then, but Democrats have said any tax increase is not off the table. So, as long as that supermajority is there, behind closed doors where most of these negotiations happen, anything is possible. So, but we did see pushback to especially the so-called pizza tax, that $1.50 retail delivery tax, and the real estate transfer tax. So if we see those return, I would have to think they would at least be reduced somewhat, because there was certainly a lot of pushback, and, then going into next year's elections, that could be quite a campaign issue.
And then one other issue that's, I think, going to be a campaign issue as well, and already is seeing the political messaging put out there, and that's dealing with energy costs. As you said, that's going to be probably an issue that dominates the fall veto session. The House and the Senate have held committees, probably 4 or 5 so far, just in the past 3 weeks, about new energy policies. And Jim, from my understanding, they're looking at just boosting more wind and solar and now battery storage facilities. But this is going to be a tall order, as Democrats supporting this and environmental groups supporting this say it's going to help bring prices down. But business groups and consumers, they could see increased prices on their bills to help pay for some of these subsidies and credits for these renewable energy resources. So clearly we're going to hear a lot more about that as well. There's going to be tons for us to tell you about. So get to thecentersquare.com and sign up for that newsletter today. Jim, always appreciate your insight and your hard work. Thank you for joining us today, and listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.